Hi, in this video we're about to install the X-axis carriage here. We're going to take these two plastic pieces which were built as part of the previous video, and it will eventually look like this. Here we've got the X-axis carriage here. You've got the mount for the extruder that runs along here. So this is the actual X direction, this is the Y direction. We'll install the two Y-axis stopper motors, the Y-axis ENDSTOP and its breaker here, and the belts and pulleys for the Y-axis here, and the X-axis pulley or belt and pulley arrangement here. So that's what we'll be building in this video. Now these are the components you'll need to build the X carriage. You'll need these two components which we built in the previous video. You'll need your two X-axis rods, and these rods are different size and they're hollow. You'll need these two. A couple of bearings, these long bolts, these two bearing holders, this piece of plastic, and a few nuts and so on. If you're building a second extruder onto your printer, you'll have a second set of all of these components here, and you build those on at the same time. We're just building a single extruder printer, so we've just got one set of these. If you're building a second extruder, you do two of these at the same time. Now here's a tip for when you're coming to push through bolts through these various plastic components. Now up until now you haven't faced this problem, but the problem you have is that sometimes these holes are a little bit too small for the bolts to go through, and you'll push them through and they won't go. So what you'll need to do is get yourself, in this case it's a 4mm drill bit, and just by hand just go through and ream it out. When you do that, you can get your bolt and it will go through quite easily. Now the same is true for 3mm holes. You'll need a 3mm diameter drill bit, but those two will see everything you need. Try out, before you assemble anything, try pushing through your bolts through all your plastic pieces first, and then you can determine which ones need to be drilled. It's much easier to do that while they're laid out on your bench like this, rather than having them half assembled in your printer and then trying to do it. So before you start assembling anything, do the push through test of all your bolts in all your plastic pieces and drill them out if necessary. So here's the carriage built just before it goes into the printer. It will go into the printer up here. This is the carriage that will hold the extruder. The extruder mounts to this piece here. And as you can see, both ends of these rods are securely tied down to each of these pieces here, and there's no flexibility in these joints here. But you've got this carriage that can slip up and down, and depending on how tight you set these nuts, you can actually contract this down and bend the rods, and that's not good, because if the distance that you have set this at causes these rods to contract, then as this carriage moves towards the end, you'll get a problem, a mismatch between the distance that can't move at this end of the plastic and the fact that this is trying to draw the rods together. So you need to be very careful about the way in which you tighten this, so that you don't cause these rods to be squashed together. If you do, you'll end up causing bearing problems and maintenance issues further down the track. Now the way you set this distance is you need to measure this distance with an accurate, right, and then as you tighten these nuts to clamp all of this carriage here down, you need to continually measure this distance here as well. So at most you want a 0.2 millimeter difference between any of these 4 points. So here, here, here and here. 0.2 millimeters maximum difference between any of those 4 points. Now you may find that like this one is right now, we've actually got the distances quite right. But the problem is that these are loosened too much, and now you can actually push the bearing out of the cap. So although the distances here were correct, this was not tightened down enough to secure the bearings in place. Now if you end up with this situation, and you probably will, what you need to do is get a couple of M4 washers and you insert them in this gap in here. One on this nut, or this bolt, and one on this bolt. And then you go through the whole process of tightening this down and doing this measurement again. So that's what we're about to do on this one, and we'll be back shortly. Now we've just rebuilt this extruder carriage here, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's a couple of washers in there. I hope you can see those. And now we've got our distances all correct, so they're all within 0.2 millimeters. We've got free travel over the whole length, and you can't push the bearings out. So that means everything's snug and tight as it should be, and all within spec, so you'll have no trouble for your extruder, or no trouble with your bearings in the long run. So that's how you set this distance, or how you set the torque, the tightness of these nuts here. Now if you've bought the second extruder as an option for this printer, you'll build a second one of these extruder carriages on here. Now when you do that, this little bracket at the top, which is to hold your wires, and this little bracket at the bottom, you still only use one of them, but this straddles the two extruders, and that actually sets the distance between the extruders, and it keeps the extruders at the same distance apart. So you don't just put a second one of these and this on here. This will straddle, and it's important that you have the ENDSTOP breaker on this side to match up with the ENDSTOP over here, so don't get this on the wrong side. The next step in building this carriage is to build the Y-axis ENDSTOP and to build the two Y-axis stepper motors. Now the only trick in all of this is to ensure that when you put the pulley on the stepper motor, you leave a 4mm gap between the body of the motor and the end of the pulley. The next step is to assemble these pulleys, which will go into the bearings in the top of the printer here. And you'll need the shaft, a pulley, a whole bunch of washers, and a securing nut. These are the pieces that you need to install this X-axis carriage onto the Y-axis rods. You need your Y-axis rods. Now these are the two longest rods in your pack. There's only two of them. And you'll need 4 sets of these rings and washers to secure the Y-axis rods in, and 4 bearings. Plus you'll need this little aluminium piece, which is part of the energy chain securing mechanism. So here we are, we've installed the X carriage here. Nothing's bolted down yet or secured down yet, it's still free to move around. Here's your extruder, the X-axis moving in this direction, your Y-axis, and of course your bed here moves up and down. So we've got all 3 degrees of movement done now. Next on the list is to install the Y-axis belt. Now the belt you'll need is the one labelled 2.3 metres, and you've got one belt but you have to cut it in half. Now you can just sit there and do that and cut it in half if you want, or the other way, which is the way we prefer, is to install one side and then, you know, with all of the cable, and then cut it to length, and then you only need to cut the cable once then, or cut the belt a single time, rather than cutting it in half and then cutting it again later. It gives you a lot more purchase to get the tension right as well if you install it in one and then cut later. So that's what we'll do, we will install it and cut it and then install it on the second side.